Today's webinar will cover a short overview of SGS and some of our experience in the mining industry, definitions and a quick history, 5 North American drivers, mining material topics and KPIs from the outside in, mining next steps from the inside out, 5-step cycle for mining firms, and a Q&A at the end. Please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. My name is Kim LaFrancois, and I am the ESG and Sustainability Business Development Manager for North America here at SGS. I've been in the testing, inspection, and certification industry for nearly 10 years, working with many different clients throughout various industries. The other speaker joining me today is Adam Hammis. Adam is the ESG Director at SGS and has 20 years of experience as corporate ESG and sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. Adam has founded multiple organizations and has an MBA with international education and leadership experience integrating ESG, CSR, and sustainability into corporate strategy. He's also taken many different courses to become a competent and effective resource for ESG and sustainability. I'll now pass it over to Adam so we can dive right in.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your day. I know that it's very busy, as always, so I won't spend a lot of time. Some of you probably know who we are. We are the world's leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company. We have a long history and we have resources, kind of boots on the ground around the world. Sustainability is not new to us. It's been embedded in our company from the top to bottom as a core value for a long time. Happy to answer more questions about this, but we've been doing this for a while. And so I think it's probably more like 30 years now, but we sit on a lot of the creation of some of the standards. We're in the working groups, and we often are some of the first verification and testing bodies that work with these groups. So we're very proud of our experience, and we get rated by a lot of the agencies that you have or will be rated by in the future. And so we're proud of that. So we get rated very highly and have a leadership role. And we continue to try to improve and strive to be moving forward. Specifically in mining, you should know that our Natural Resources Division has a very strong focus on minerals and mining, a whole sustainability value chain offering in multiple pieces, not just ESG. But when you look at that as an example from the Business Assurance Division, I'll show you a quick case study. We do work recently with a Canadian diversified mining company. If you look at just what it looks like and from a reporting standpoint, from a 2020 data all the way to, hopefully we'll continue to work with them for a long time, but we're in the process of doing 2023 data. So they have a CSR report or their sustainability report. What that is a 133-page report. They're GRI, SASB, and TCFD compliant, or at least indexed to those 3 standards. And that started out very small from scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions with 1 environmental KPI, and has grown. They've grown with us in scope to now their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions with 3 environmental and 5 social KPIs. And that is not an uncommon thing for people to dip their toe and to sort of grow and evolve, expand the number of KPIs that they are assuring year over year as they become more material to the company or to stakeholders. So theirs is limited assurance. What that looks like is just from a CPA standpoint, there's a lower threshold than a reasonable assurance, but it's still very much respected in the industry. And for non-financial data, limited assurance is very, very common. The entire engagement that we worked with them was 1 month in total from March 5th to April 7th. We had on-site audits as well that can really help close findings, which the closing findings piece, which people don't always understand, can take weeks. This is not a management system. This is both process systems, data collection, but also accuracy and making sure that you've met all the standards. Often it's an ISO standard. We'll talk about that in a second, but the process is really document requests, assurance planning, assurance audit. Closing that findings is where you get a nice detailed list of here are the things that we need to see before we can close this out and issue you, not a certificate, but a statement of opinion, much like a CPA would. And that is to say, this is a limited negative opinion that we did not find evidence to suggest that this material statement is false, or a reasonable assurance would be we did find evidence to find this material statement is true. You might already be familiar with that, but the actual deliverable is a statement. We try to make it look nice because a lot of these get published in reports. And this particular client had an ISO standard specifically for greenhouse gas, as well as a sustainability report for ESG KPI assurance for all their other emissions that did not need to meet the CARB reporting that they had. So that's just one of the things that, it's one of the options is common request from our clients. So just so you have a sense of what is that published ESG or sustainability report, that's what we typically deal in. Have your organization published an annual ESG or sustainability report? Yes, no, or I don't know. And this is just one threshold. It just gives you a sense of where you're at, because it does take a significant amount of effort to, maybe over the course of 1 to 2 years. And I'll put yes for us, because SGS has been doing it for very, very many years. We actually have an integrated report, which, not to brag, we kind of do it to show off, to let people know what we can help our clients with. But integrated reporting is one of the kind of most robust, and that's where the industry is really pushing some of the leadership in to make it at the same level of financial reporting. And so I'll give you a few more seconds, but if you don't have an annual ESG report or an annual sustainability report, or you might call it a social impact report or a CSR report, whatever that is, it just means that you're probably still putting the effort in and gathering some of the data. That in itself can take a couple of years, maybe 3 the most, for the first time through, because some companies just aren't sure and they don't realize the amount of work it takes. So I'll give you about a few more seconds, then I'll show everybody what the results are. If you haven't submitted your answer yet. So a lot of you, yes, you're already publishing, so that's fantastic. Hopefully this isn't, this is going to help you take the next step, and some gaps, but no, and I don't know. Definitely go check out your website. Sometimes companies don't do a great job of marketing to their own internal employees that they've done it. But if you just Google your company name or look around your website, if you can't find it, you probably don't have one published. So what are we talking about? Just so I don't confuse anyone, these acronyms and labels get misused and used in different fashions. So I'm going to tell you just what we mean by ESG and sustainability reporting. So at the purest sense, ESG is just non-financial reporting that is material to the business. It comes from the publicly traded sphere. It comes from 50 plus years of, post the Great Recession and Great Depression, in the 1920s. But sometimes people call it extra financial, because it definitely has a financial component. It's material, financial to the business. But ESG is an investor and a CPA-driven term that comes from publicly traded companies in the financial sector. And it's very much about material, financial materiality for businesses. Why? Is because what I mentioned in the past, I'll jump over a lot of history, but before the 1920s, historical cost accounting was everything. That's all people cared about. And then they realized after the Great Depression and a world economic collapse that really they shifted to what's the purpose of financial reporting in itself. It's forward-looking, decision-useful data for investors, banks, and other users of those statements. And so if you look at what that did and what that changed, was redefining what needed to be in the financial reports, and a lot of non-financials for context were a focus, where tangible assets were 83% of the S&P 500 in 1975 of the market value, and the management discussion sections for context came up for the first time in 1980. And then what you saw was for the first time in the early 90s, a creation, a slow and steady, of business tools, standards, frameworks that actually helped businesses do these things. And it's only now kind of reaching a pinnacle of alignment. Whereas some of the things I'll point out is now in 2020, 90% of the S&P 500 has the value is in intangible, like intellectual property, brand value, goodwill, things that can disappear quickly if you are in a negative PR, or if you hit a regulatory snag and you're in the news. And so there's a big push that ESG has an impact because of market value. And climate risk as just one example of ESG. It's one very popular one, but it was named the #1 economic issue hitting supply chains around the world in 2022 in a climate risk survey. And so that's the kind of the ESG evolution. There's plenty of other environmental and social movement stuff that is not pure financial materiality. So when we talk about that, we're going to talk about a lot of what's material to the business. You often hear people say, and again, they use it differently, but if I talk about double materiality, that's often adding the impact materiality or sustainability, what's good for the planet, what's good for society. But ESG at its purest sense is how are social and environmental issues affecting the bottom line of the company. So it's not a lot of things to argue about as far as they're too progressive. A lot of the KPIs that you'll see from an ESG standard or framework are not the ones that make you cry and feel like you're going to save the world. But sustainability is very much linked to it. If you're going to add double materiality, CSRD, the things coming out of Europe are very much kind of embedded with GRI and some of these other standards. And just so you see the clear alignment, that things with integrated reporting, SASB, TCFD, those all became the Value Reporting Foundation, and it got absorbed into IFRS last year. And they rolled out S1 and S2, two new standards. So there is a lot of alignment with everything that is investor driven for financial materiality, whereas GRI, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, those are all still very much what's good for the planet, what's good for society, and that won't change anytime soon. But if you're looking for pure financial materiality, it's easy to find the standards that are for you and your business. So that's it for history. What trend does your business see in stakeholder expectations for ESG and sustainability performance? None or no change, increasing expectations, or decreasing expectations. And so again, it's really important that no matter what I say and no matter what information we share, that there's never an off-the-shelf solution that everyone should do. And so if you have if you see a competitor, if you see somebody else in another region, if they're privately held, publicly held, if the size of number of employees, everything can matter. So we're giving you a big outside-in look in the next section at what is being asked for per industry. But definitely, it's really important to know what your expectations are so you can develop a strategy that adds business value in the long term. It's not just reactionary. You'll hear us say that time and time again. So I'll give you about 5 more seconds. I'll say we see increasing. We're obviously in the solutions business, so we do a lot in the solutions, but also just the expectations for our own internal performance and our own scores keeps increasing as well. So none or no change, a few, which is absolutely important to know. And then the most of us see increasing. That's not uncommon. There are some industries that see it decreasing. I think that's a good thing if the materiality assessments are accurate and you aren't really under a target for some of these issues. It's important to know. But let's look at what's driving it pretty quickly, just to talk about regulation. And I would not have put regulation as number 1 in the US and Canada, North America, just a few years ago, but we're starting to catch up, specifically when it comes to greenhouse gas regulations. IFRS S2 is more of a Canadian thing. The US still does GAP, so IFRS doesn't apply to us. But if you're doing international business, it does. The S2 standard really takes effect this year. So at the end of this year, folks will, to be compliant with IFRS, they'll have to meet S2. The greenhouse gas reporting programs in both countries are for those heavy emitters, the federal programs. There's a federal supplier rule and an FRFI, that's a federally regulated financial institutions ruling that came out in Canada. So there's a lot of impact of big suppliers to the federal government, as well as banking institutions, the large ones, and anyone in asset classes who are loaning from those banks are now having to look at how do they report their emissions to the bank. And then the USA is very similar. We have FDIC guidance to our largest banks. California has their SB 253 and 261 greenhouse gas regulations for reporting. And the proposed rule, I actually take it out now. I apologize, just a few days ago, the SEC did issue their climate rule. So that's not proposed anymore, but we have a federal supplier rule that is also very much mirrors what's happening in Canada, but it will impact far more companies. So there's a lot around greenhouse gas. But if you're international, there's a lot of broad ESG regulation, which is the EU has the CSRD, and they continuously roll out new legislation with that to further define and clarify the reporting. And IFRS S1 is the general standard for everything not climate related. So if you are in Canada, obviously, it's going to fall under you as well, or if you're doing business in Canada. So that's the regulatory driver that is quite different than just a few years ago. And then the ESG ratings. And this is really coming for only the big publicly held companies, but DJSI, MSCI, ISS, and Sustainalytics have been around for a while, and they're under a lot of scrutiny. This is where a lot of the ESG backlash comes from, to make sure they're more transparent and they give you clear guidance on how to improve your scores. But that's because these are being used by investors and creditors to make buy, sell, and lend decisions. But what's really happening for this is, because this is whether you want to be scored or not, if you're publicly held, you have a score. They scrape your publicly held, reported information, and you get a score, and it's available to anyone to see. But what that has caused is a second wave of smaller, medium-sized companies in the supply chain, all kinds of producers looking at brands. The big companies are pushing down to them things like CDP questionnaires, EcoVadis questionnaires, and saying, we want you to report this information because we need it to manage our supply chain transparency and improve our scores. So now you have these really large numbers of companies, hundreds to thousands, getting a request from a big brand. And these are some of the companies that are in those programs. And they have publicly committed to using either EcoVadis, which is a broad ESG reporting platform, or CDP, which is specific to climate change. And they're publicly have said, we are going to ask all of our suppliers to report in these platforms. And so that's starting to hit a lot of companies for the first time as well. We have workshops, very technical 4-hour workshops that dive into things like the EcoVadis workshop, which is on April 11th. We invite you to come. And the things that are further down the list, but are still there if you're a consumer, not really for mining, but you're going to see this happening where lots of consumers are asking for things and it's pushing down into the raw materials portion. And you're starting to say like, hey, we need reporting so we can put this label on a product. So it's a longer timeline for that, but it does matter. And then employees. There's a lot of surveys looking at what do not necessarily like hourly workers and low paying like blue collar jobs, but white collar, or sorry, flip it, but high value like managerial positions on up that are hard to find. Those leadership positions are getting harder and harder to keep people if you're not doing something around ESG and sustainability. So again, I mentioned a few kind of in order for North America, but what's important is you know what your number one driver is for ESG and sustainability performance. Is it regulatory pressure specifically? It's probably a mix of some of these, but what's your number one? And then you can kind of go down that list. For ESG ratings, is it supply chain customer pressure? It's probably not consumers because this is a mining, employees, and other. And if you have other, I'll just reiterate what Summer and Kim said is there's a Q&A box. Definitely type in what your other pressure is or what your driver is. We'd love to hear that. But give it a second and choose. For us, I would say it's just client pressure, supply chain. You know, I could say supply chain, it's more like client pressure, but we were doing this anyway for a long time. We are publicly traded, so ESG ratings are up there for us as well. It's important that we compete, which we do very well, and we're a leader in our industry, but because we're so a large Swiss company that's publicly traded, our ESG ratings are looked at by a lot of people globally. So I could put both of those. I'll give you a few more seconds to choose. Like I said, it's usually a mix of 3 or 4 of these, but it's important to put I would say force rank them, because when you're developing a strategy and what you're going to report, it really should reflect, which is called a materiality assessment, what your actual drivers are. So I'll go ahead and see this. A lot of regulatory, ESG ratings, some supply chain customers. That's interesting because sometimes it's a little higher. And then consumers. So we even have some consumers folks here, so welcome. Nobody on employees or other yet, but I think that's going to grow over time, especially with the younger generation. So now let's talk about what's actually being from the outside in. So what are the topics and KPIs that the mining industry is being told they have participated, but in things like frameworks, international framework standards and rating agencies. So for instance, MSCI, SASB standards, the EcoVadis platform, looking across all of these, what are the consistent topics and KPIs that the mining industry is being told that they should be reporting on? And there is, I should say, industry participation in a lot of these issues. You can have comment periods. There's people at the table, multi-stakeholder working groups that you can join, but there are abilities to participate, and it's been mostly investors and mining industry professionals that come up with these. So they are valuable. They're not perfect, but they do continue to get refined over time. So number one, and you'll see this over and over again, is really governance and ethics is going to take the cake. And it's not your typical governance and ethics of just the entire company. It's typically what is your governance structure and ethics around ESG, so environmental, social, and governance topics. What's the group that holds that management and reporting responsibility to define your material topics? Who are the names? What's the stakeholder engagement process you use to identify these? What did you include? What did you exclude? So these are they're governance and ethics, but it's usually specific to how are you managing ESG specifically? Certification to any governance standards like ISO 27001, 37001, but also your suppliers, like how many tier 1 suppliers are certified to the same governance standards. And then the production in countries with 20 lowest rankings in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, some very specific things for the mining industry. And as you hear up here, I actually pulled 2, sometimes metals and minings will have some specialties. So coal operations, these are both identical, but I'll show you a few later that are more specific to things like just coal, and some, if you're not in coal, you're really not asked for that KPI. Hold on, Marina asks, you talked about materiality assessment. Can you talk a bit more about the double materiality? How is this expected to be done and reported? So if you fall under the CSRD, that's a great question, Marina. Materiality assessment is the process you go through, which typically is some desk research. You can look at these frameworks and standards, but there's often a requirement for stakeholder engagement, which means you're first identifying key stakeholders, and then you're engaging with them to get their feedback on what they think are the most important environmental, social, and governance issues that you should be focused on as a company, and specifically because they're interested in them. So what are their priorities, and how do you align with your key stakeholders? And so that is what a materiality assessment is. There is a pure, just financial materiality assessment that can be done in-house, but stakeholder engagement is almost always required. Some sort of desk research, you can disclose and say for CSRD, for instance, that is, they do allow for some justification where we didn't actually do a focus group or surveys, but we highly recommend some level of focus group surveys, phone calls, if you're going to do just desk research, it should be incredibly valuable publications from these groups that you know are relevant, but you're really asking them, what do they care about and why do they think you should be doing it? And if you do double materiality, that's that, I won't go all the way back, but when I showed the 2 side-by-side kind of globes where financial material questions are just, you include topics that are financially material to the business only. But if you do double materiality, you have to include topics that are impact materiality focused, that are what is the business's impact on society and the planet. So it's more of the negative impacts is often associated with. It can be the positive, but often the positives are in the financial materiality because there are opportunities to do sales and marketing. But the difference, and when people say double materiality, it is where, are you asking questions about your impacts on the world or about the world's impacts on you? And that's just the difference. You can do one or the other, but double materiality is usually associated with CSRD and the GRI framework. Great question. Sorry, I kind of rambled on. The next, and from an environmental standpoint, it's actually more waste and emissions, not greenhouse gas emissions, but toxic waste and other forms of waste. We'll look at total non-mineral waste and tailings, rock waste, hazardous waste, recycled waste, significant incidents associated with hazardous waste and materials, waste management, any policies for active and inactive operations, tailings storage facilities, inventory tables, tailings management systems and governance to monitor and maintain stability, emergency preparedness and response plans for those tailing storage facilities, and then more for just metals and minings, not as much coal operations, but air emissions from all the different incredibly important air emissions that you need to focus on. And so as we go down the lines, you'll see they're not groundbreaking things. These are, ESG often is like, there's a collection of KPIs that you're already familiar with, and that's because they're material to the company. Labor health and safety on the social side is really about workforce. Often they want to know how much of your workforce is under collective bargaining agreements, what's the number and duration of strikes and lockouts, rates of incidents, fatalities, near misses. Certification to a social standard, 45001 from ISO is one of the most popular and required. And then also not just you, but are your tier 1 suppliers certified to any of those social standards as well. But then in metals and mining, you'll often see make sure you have the health, safety, and emergency response training, and how many hours for employees and contractors. For next, environmental, you often have biodiversity and land use because your mining takes up a huge amount of land use. And so you're looking at very evenly across both coal and other metals and mining, environmental management policies and practices for active sites, mine sites where acid rock drainage is predicted, actively mitigated, and under treatment or remediation, or proved or provable reserves in or near sites with protected conservation status or endangered species habitat. Again, back to social, this is more supply chain, human rights, and community relations, but it's less about your employees, and it could be folks in the supply chain, it could be indigenous relationships, but I'll show you here. Any risk, opportunity, and crisis management with community rights and interests. Again, those can be broad, it depends on the site. Number and duration of non-technical days of site shutdown or project delays, engagement and due diligence with human rights, child labor, forced labor, indigenous rights, and or conflict areas. Again, not all of these always apply, but they're usually important or a mix of those at all sites. And then proved and provable reserves in or near indigenous land, whereas coal operations, or not coal operations, but other metals and minings tend to be with proved and probable, which I have a typo there, reserves in or near areas of conflict. Environmental, we get down lower, it's not as common, but water then comes up for incidents of non-compliance with water quality permits, standards, and regulations, and then water withdrawn and consumed with a percentage, which of that is a percentage of regions from high or extremely high baseline water stress areas. And that's coming from things like the aqueduct, WRI aqueduct program, which is pretty easy to map for free. And then last but not least, which is you kind of expect it to be higher, but again, looking at material risks, climate risks are not the top of the list, but they're still there. Short and long-term strategy for emissions, targets, and reductions, gross global scope 1 emissions, and the percent of those emissions that are under emission regulations. You can see that's a very financially material kind of an approach. But then also in coal operations, you'll see future price sensitivity of reserves to a price on carbon emissions, because coal is very much associated with carbon emissions. So you have additional items where estimated embedded emissions in your proven reserves, and then how price and demand for regulation influence capital expenditure strategy for exploration, acquisition, and asset development. So a ton of these KPIs, they're nothing that sexy, they're very operational focused, and that's because it's coming at it from a financial materiality lens under ESG. When it comes to greenhouse gas, I'll just put in a little plug here that SGS has a ton of greenhouse gas training. We're known for our greenhouse gas training, and we do all the different standards for organizational footprints, project footprints, product footprints, as well as we can train people to be verifiers who work for us or work for you, that can really help you make sure that your verified data, you're ready to get verified. And we have a June 3rd through 7th series coming up if you want to check it out. But I'll get back to this. Marina had a really good question. I mentioned it briefly. How you determine which of these KPIs matter for you, which we've given you a laundry list here of KPIs, but have you conducted your own formal materiality assessment process? Maybe it was only desk research, but have you gone about that? Because it typically is an identification, an inclusion, and exclusion exercise, along with a pretty comprehensive ranking system, because you might have 20 or 30 possible topics, but you've got to prioritize your most important ones, and that's the purpose of a materiality assessment. So if you have done that, yes. If you haven't, no. If you don't know, some people don't publish their actual materiality assessment. That's becoming more and more common as it becomes more and more regulated by things like CSRD. But we can say yes from SGS standpoint. We've done it, and I think we update it. We review it every year, but I think we do a full reboot like every 3 years. I'll have to check with our team. That's a pretty common approach. Like when COVID hit in 2020, everybody was updating their materiality assessments because they were no longer up to date with that, dealing with the fallout of that and regulatory pressure and employee issues, everything that came with it. So has your company conducted a formal materiality assessment? The majority here, 70%, my hat is off to you. Great job. I hope you keep reviewing it. I hope you re-update it every few years. No, or I don't know, you're also in good company. It is something that does take some work. You can kind of scale it down for the level. If you don't need CSRD compliance, for instance, we do something called a gap analysis, which is basically a scaled down version of a full materiality assessment. But if it doesn't need to be CSRD compliant, you can obviously save some time, save some money, and still have an incredibly valuable output. And then what's next? So one thing is to look at what the ratings agencies, the frameworks, and the standards are saying. But what we're going to focus on, and which I invite you to come back to in June 17th, mining is one of our key industries. So we're doing this in a lot of different industries. We're doing actual research on the top 100 companies in the mining industry in North America. What's their actual public reporting behavior in trends? What are the framework standards and rating agencies being used? Material ESG topics and priorities, measurable KPIs and targets, as well as already getting third-party certification, verification, and assurance. And that's just another incredibly valuable from a competitive standpoint of, okay, the external bodies are saying this. Yes, the industry participates in those creations, but what's actually happening today on the ground in the reporting world? And so that's incredibly valuable. We've already started launching a few of those, but we're excited to do the mining industry, and that will be out on June 17th. And why is third-party assurance helpful? It just provides internal confidence, even if you're not doing it for a regulatory scheme, if you're not doing it for your own, a stakeholder who requires it, your internal confidence in making investments and strategies based off data. You want to be sure that your data is being calculated appropriately and to the standards that everyone else is calculating their data, because you don't want to be caught unaware, or somebody has a claim against you and says you're greenwashing, and then you don't have a defensible set of data and calculations. Also, meeting regulatory requirements, it does help you improve all of your ESG ratings and scores if you get third-party assurance, and then external confidence for customers and stakeholders. But essentially, it just goes across this pretty smooth journey that we highly recommend. You look at training in greenhouse gas or sustainability and ESG broadly, that you look at training followed by execution, and that can be accounting help, software help. The only thing on here that we don't do is the software, because we are assurance providers. But then you have spot checks that are actually very cost effective and faster than getting a full assurance with a statement of opinion, that you can check your systems without the accuracy of the data and still see, or an ESG pre-assurance of how you're doing. And then you get into limited and reasonable verification, is what the term is typically used in greenhouse gas, or report assurance if you're using a full sustainability report assurance with anything besides greenhouse gas emissions. So we invite you to do that. We can have a call and talk to you more about it. But the question I would pose to you is, have you gotten any third-party assurance? Because it's really that dip your toe in the water with everybody that we see, and to know where you're heading. Because oftentimes people first start with greenhouse gas emissions. Often that's because the regulatory pressure is coming the hardest on greenhouse gas. Then some people have, well, yes, we've done multiple KPIs that we think are also material. Some folks have gone as far as doing a whole report to say, are we GRI compliant? Are we SASB compliant? That's a little more looking at the context of your report. Some people have no third-party assurance. They've only done internal reviews with their financial team, or you might not know. The best way to know is to open up a sustainability report, and often you'll see either visible graphics that sort of have a green check marks, or there's a list or a paragraph about the assurance that you've taken and which KPIs have been assured and which haven't, as well as what we showed you at the beginning. Usually companies and even our competitors, we try to give you a nice report so that it's publishable and public facing and it looks nice. And you'll often see the assurance statement even published in the report itself. So whether you have yes, kind of stair-stepping it in, wherever you're at in your process, let us know. I believe that we are not even, it's a good question. I am on this team, but not at the level that I actually know whether we're fully GRI or fully SASB compliant. I should check that out with our team. I think they're headed in Spain. So I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, this is much more balanced, and I think assurance is coming online more so now than it has been in the past. Obviously, people have done it, but a really nice balance of greenhouse gas only, multiple KPIs, whole report. I like to see that. My hat is off to you, 16.7%. Knows and I don't knows, you're also a good company. We're all working on this together, so great job. Now, to look at how you actually go about approaching it, and hopefully if you've done this for a long time, this isn't anything new, but I do hear from clients that they still really like this graphic. So we talk about what is the journey that you need to go on. And it's really a cycle. It's not a linear journey. It's something that happens. And the more you do it, you kind of review everything throughout the year, but it's still a maturity cycle that you go through. You have to do awareness. You have to grow your training and your own competencies internally, and use, if you need to, vendors. But before you set priorities, you shouldn't do materiality assessment, pick your risks and opportunities and prioritize them unless you've made yourself more aware of the issues. Then you can set your strategy around those priorities. So you're not creating a strategy for 22 material topics. You're doing it for like the number 6 or 7. Like, there's got to be a reasonable amount. And when I see reports, it's always kind of, you always wonder, because you can downscale and say, hey, we're just reporting it to meet some need of a stakeholder, but an actual strategy that's realistically going to be achievable is not going to be for 20 KPIs or topics. It's going to be for 6 or 7 or 8 or something very reasonable, because you have a lot of other priorities in the company. Then you execute that strategy. That's a whole nother area, and a lot of help and support is going to be required for initiatives, projects, quality management. And then when you report last, tell your story. Is it usually a combination of how we're managing this issue, but also what is our performance over time? And that can be to a select group of stakeholders, or it can be very much public. But once you go through that process and have established an annual report, typically you're doing this on an annual basis, and it becomes an every year thing. And the sequence itself that we described is in place to mitigate risk. If you set your priorities without building awareness, you're going to pick wrong, or you're risking picking wrong. If you set a strategy before you really narrow down your priorities, it's going to be not nearly as valuable and succinct of a strategy. If you try to execute and just go out and chase things and very reactionary, you're not going to see positive benefits and performance from a day-to-day operational standpoint. And if you just go out doing reporting without a clear plan, you're not going to get the results you want from that. There's a lot of risks in reporting, that you want to do it wisely in the most succinct, concise way to the right people and the right audience. And you can really do a lot of this at the beginning with this internal strategist group. And so awareness, priorities, and strategy, usually, in most cases, this is a governance question, but you need a senior ESG committee or some other name that you call it, but it is a senior level strategy position. You can't set ESG strategy from being a quality manager or an HSE manager, kind of middle management of the company. It really needs to be, if it's material to the business, a top-down strategy. You have board oversight, C-suite individuals, VPs and directors. If you have a dedicated ESG professional, sometimes that person is on that council as well. And then lead counsel from a risk and a legal standpoint is very common. But that's the type of people who sit on the senior ESG committee and come up with the strategy, obviously with input from other folks, but they're the ones making the call. They have the broadest view across the organization. Here's what it looks like just as a mining example. This is publicly available information. We gave you the link to the report. But if you look, most companies who do a good job are also reporting on those 5 steps. So here is their governance structure. They've detailed it out. They've got a description, but they've got a map too of here are different committees from a board level up. And then they say, here's our actual stakeholder involvement process. Here are the stakeholders that we prioritize, and here's how we engage with them to determine our material topics. And then here's a laundry list of KPIs. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 topics. Still pretty good, I would say. But they put specific KPIs in each one of those and descriptions of the KPIs. So they've taken you on that journey with them, and they've showed you why we report this specific set of KPIs. It's because of our governance, it's because of our stakeholder engagement and materiality assessment, and therefore this is our set of reporting characteristics and criteria. So that's it. When you get here, you're going to have your whole nother suite of execution implementers with project managers, operations managers, subject matter experts, risk and quality managers. And in reporting, you really should have a whole separate team that is communications professionals, marketing, investor relations, government affairs, legal compliance, because they all have a specific role to play if you want to be successful in this effort. So from yourself, just as an individual coming to this webinar today, which steps of the cycle fit strongest with your current role? Are you more of a strategist who would do steps 1 through 3 and maybe sit on the ESG senior committee? Are you an implementer who owns a particular material topic? Do you own greenhouse gas emissions? Do you own health and safety? and you're responsible for day-to-day performance, or are you on the reporting side? Are you marketing, communications, investor relations, legal compliance, things like that, that you're trying to put together the storytelling so that it meets the standards and the frameworks and what the rating agencies expect or the regulators expect, because that's important of how you go forward and not only develop yourself, but look for opportunities in the company to say, hey, I think we're a little weak here on either my team, or we don't have enough implementers, or we don't actually have a full-blown ESG senior committee, and I think that's a weakness that we could really remedy. So all those things you could think about. I'm interesting because I work for SGS. I'd say I'm a strategist, but I do all of the above, mostly reporting and strategist because we help clients, but I do work on the reporting side as well for the company globally and try to help out. So here we have a very nice mix, and it's really nice to see some of the implementers on here, but a nice balance between strategist, implementer, and reporter. It's not to say you can't cross over, but the duties that you need in those positions are very unique, and can't say that enough. I'll say that here's some promotion of ours, but we do training, and we have day-long courses. We have a beginning course called Foundation, but we have a day-long course, June 4th through 6th is coming up. We do it quarterly, but we have a strategy for people who are in leadership positions, execution for people who are implementing, and reporting for people who are in reporting. So we really focus on specific role-based training. Here's a wonderful thing. Our YouTube channel is growing with tons of free training. If you want any of our webinars, live recordings, live events, we've done some virtual facility tours behind the scenes. We're going to add some training sessions where we've got, I think, close to 100 as we're kind of scheduling it out, Summer would say. But we have it from a ton of great content, very technical in nature. It's very helpful. If you want to go check out our YouTube channel, please do it. It's just SGS North America. But we're going to continue to add more and more content over time, and we'll have mining-specific stuff and just industry-wide, internationally kind of applicable stuff. But I can't say enough about leveraging this as a new resource for all of our clients. And what questions do you have? Because Kim's here, I'm here, and we can come back to you if we can't answer them, but hopefully covered a lot of ground here today, and if you have anything we can help with, we're here. I'm sorry, my voice is a little froggy. I'll drink some tea. Use the Q&A box if you want to type them in. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but you can let me know. While we wait, one question that we often hear is like the SEC ruling just came out. It is important for you to stay on top of regulatory changes. We mentioned a lot of them up front here, but the reality is, I think the SEC ruling is like a 2029. There won't be assurance until 2029, and there won't be reporting requirements until 2026. But if you want to map that to the California ruling, the Canadian regulations, one thing to at least consider, because some clients will say, well, we're not going to do anything until we absolutely have to. Waiting to the last minute is not a great strategy. At least getting training and understanding what's going to be expected of you, but doing your first reporting and making sure that you're moving and preparing, because the regulatory schemes are only increasing. So I don't think what you're seeing from the US and from Canada will stop, or it might slow down. You know, we're in an election year. That always has some impact. But what is almost guaranteed, if you look at history, the international sphere is still moving. If it's not Asia, then it's Europe, then it's South America, and the US and Canada. It continues to move forward. It slows down sometimes in different regions, but it doesn't go backwards. And so just to throw out there that when you see things get announced, it is important to understand the timing and the time frame, but it's also important to look at the bigger picture. And I would say just don't be caught unaware, and we're always here to help answer questions so that you're not waiting till the last minute.
I wanted to bring up, I get this question quite often from clients who are reaching out to us for support. Oftentimes clients are asked either by vendors or by clients for ESG certification. They want them to be ESG certified. We know after today that ESG is an incredibly large topic. And while we're happy to connect with folks to talk this through, how would you recommend companies kind of put that back on the requester to dive a bit deeper to find out exactly what they're looking for?
Yeah, that is a very common question. ESG, I think when people ask that, their assumption is that ESG is like a topic specific, almost like an ISO 9001, and can we just get it and do it? But it is very different. Not only, greenhouse gas itself is not as simple, like ISO 14064-1 is a verification and validation. It's different than all the ISO management systems. It's looking at data, but that's still a topic validation, where ESG is really a lens at which you look at your company. There are some things out there. We even offer an ESG certification, but we tell everybody this is a later phase, very mature, because we're checking all of the things. We're checking, have you done a materiality assessment, and how did you do it? Is it aligned with any standards that you should be applying or complying with? And therefore, are your material topics the right ones? And we can give you feedback on that. And then if your topics are right, have you picked KPIs that reflect your industry and your region and your company? Because sometimes the KPIs can be not aligned. You pick a topic, but you just throw in the KPIs that you liked or that you had available, but they weren't actually what the industry is looking for, or users like banks and investors are looking for, or the public. And so ESG certification does exist. In some instances, it's becoming more of a standard specific. There are some things per industry that you might find, but mining has the Together for Sustainable Mining. That's an example. It's still, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's great. And it's a good direction to move in. And it is trying to say, what would a certification look like for our industry? But I would say that that's not the main focus. You should slow down and first do a materiality assessment. Well, you should do awareness, priority setting, and then strategy, and all those tools we mentioned, which is training, materiality assessment, that includes stakeholder engagement, and that's what you use. It doesn't make you, doesn't prescribe what you have to do, but it informs your decision making, and it's incredibly valuable. And it's understated how valuable it is to senior leaders to get that feedback from stakeholders and actually have a very clear sense of, oh, this is why we're doing this versus this. This is why we're including this topic and excluding this topic. This is why we're choosing this KPI and not this KPI, because your stakeholders tell you specifically, or you need to meet a particular standard and framework, and it's not guesswork. You're not wondering. The confidence that it instills in a program is actually quite underrepresented in the discussions about materiality assessment. Often people talk about price and expensiveness, but they don't talk about the business value that they can provide.
Thanks, Adam. Well, that covers the agenda today, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Adam directly if you've got any additional questions or if we can be of any help. Thank you so much, Adam, for all the wonderful information, and thank you all for your time. Hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.